The fluorescent lights hummed overhead like a swarm of insects trapped in glass, their white hum coating everything in a sterile glow. Ashley Cooper moved through the corridors of Mercy General with the kind of efficiency that made her invisible, the way ghosts move through walls. She didn't rush. She didn't make noise. Her scrubs were pressed, her badge clipped at exactly the same angle every shift, her hand steady as a surgical laser even when the monitors screamed. The smell of antiseptic and stale coffee hung in the air like a permanent resident, mixed with something underneath that only people who'd worked trauma knew to recognize, the copper scent of old blood that never quite washed away no matter how much bleach they used. It was her second week at Mercy General in Norfolk, and nobody here knew that her hands had held together people the military wanted forgotten. Nobody knew that the calluses on her palms came from rope rappels in the Hindu Kush, or that the thin white scar running along her collarbone was from shrapnel at Sangin. They saw a competent nurse in her late 30s with dark hair pulled back and a face that revealed nothing. They saw someone who checked vitals, documented blood pressures, and moved between rooms with the kind of purposeful calm that suggested she'd done this 10,000 times. Which she had, just not in a hospital. The cardiac unit at Mercy General operated like most cardiac units, controlled chaos, beeping monitors, a hierarchy as rigid as a military chain of command. The difference was that Ashley could see things the full-time staff missed. On her third day, she'd noticed that the inventory for stents didn't match the procedure logs. By the end of her first week, she'd flagged 3 separate billing discrepancies in the supply orders, cases where the hospital had been charged for cardiac equipment that either never arrived or arrived in quantities that didn't match the invoices. She documented everything in her charting with the same precision she'd used to log ammunition counts and field supplies during her deployments. Meticulous. Dated. Numbered. The kind of charting that left no room for interpretation. She didn't know at the time that those discrepancies belonged to someone. Dr. Marcus Hargrove had run the cardiac unit for 8 years. He was 52, divorced twice, drove a silver Mercedes, and had a standing reservation at the most expensive steakhouse in Norfolk every Friday night. He'd built those Friday dinners on a foundation of carefully negotiated kickbacks from MedTech Solutions, a medical supply company that padded its invoices by 40%, split the difference with him, and called it a partnership. The arrangement had made him an extra $80,000 a year for nearly a decade. It was, by his calculation, the most elegant arrangement he'd ever constructed. Until Ashley Cooper arrived and started noticing things. He first noticed her during a morning rounds review when he saw her name on a flagged report in the system. Not just once. 3 times. 3 separate billing anomalies, all documented in her charting, all tied directly to the supply orders he'd been authorizing. He'd read her notes with the feeling of watching dominoes begin their fall. Methodical. Detailed. Untraceable. The kind of documentation that would hold up in an audit. The kind of documentation that would hold up in a deposition. Hargrove had 2 responses to threats: eliminate them or control them. He chose control first. The cafeteria was crowded on her 8th day. Ashley sat alone at a table in the corner with a tray of salad and water, a book propped against the salt shaker. She'd learned to keep her meals quiet, her presence minimal. It was easier that way. It was how you stayed invisible. Hargrove sat down at a table with 2 other physicians, Dr. Patricia Chen from surgery and Dr. Robert Voss from internal medicine, and he made sure his voice carried across the cafeteria like a radio transmission meant to reach everyone but directed at no one in particular. "I give her 7 days, Hargrove said, loud enough that the conversation at Ashley's table could hear it clearly. New nurses never last on the cardiac unit. Too demanding. Too many codes. She'll be gone by Friday." Chen glanced up from her plate, understanding the subtext. "What makes you so sure?" "Call it experience," Hargrove said. He smiled, and the smile was exactly the kind of smile a man makes when he's already won the game. "Some people just don't have what it takes to work here. You can tell right away. She's too quiet. Quiet people break." Voss laughed. Small, mean laughter. The sound of professional men enjoying a private joke at someone else's expense. Ashley turned a page in her book. Her hands didn't shake. Her breathing didn't change. She read the same sentence 3 times because the words weren't registering anymore, but her external self remained absolutely still. Muscle memory, she thought. The same compartmentalization that had kept her functional in places where showing emotion meant showing weakness. Where quiet meant you were dangerous. Where invisible meant you survived. She finished her water. She closed her book. She picked up her tray and walked past their table to clear it, and as she passed Hargrove, she felt his eyes on her like a weight. Testing. Probing. Trying to find a crack in the facade. She didn't give him one. The thing nobody understood about people who'd served was that they'd already faced the worst thing a person could face, the knowledge that they might not come home. Everything after that existed on a different scale. A job threat was static electricity compared to the memory of a helicopter's blades chopping through smoke, or the feeling of carrying someone you didn't know you'd ever see again 3 miles through territory where every sound could be an ambush. Hargrove's contempt registered somewhere around the level of an irritating itch. Noticeable. Acknowledged. Not cared about. What Ashley didn't know was that her chart flags had already made Hargrove's calculations shift. Elimination was becoming the only viable option. The hospital's admissions desk called down to the cardiac unit at 2:13 p.m. on a Tuesday, 2 days after Hargrove's cafeteria performance. A 4-star general admitted through the emergency department with a history of acute ischemic stroke, left side weakness, slightly slurred speech. The bed in room for 47 was being prepped. Ashley was the nurse assigned to his initial intake. She didn't know his name until she saw the chart. General Marcus Webb, retired Special Forces Command, 71 years old, admitted with stroke symptoms but stable. She pushed the intake cart down the hallway with its squeaking wheels and opened the door to room for 47 to find an old man with steel-grey hair and a military bearing even in a hospital gown, his left arm wrapped in an 4-line. She introduced herself with her first name only, the way she did with everyone. "I'm Ashley. I'll be helping you today." She ran through the vital signs with practiced efficiency, noting the blood pressure, the pulse, the oxygen saturation. Her hands moved on their own, performing tasks so ingrained they didn't require her conscious attention. That was when she saw it. The tattoo was faded almost to invisibility on his left forearm, blue ink that had aged into something grey-green with time. She could read it only because she was looking for nothing in particular, her eyes just moving across his skin as she checked the placement of the 4-line. A. Cooper, Sangin Guardian Angel. The date underneath it, 2011. Her hands froze for exactly 2 seconds. That was all. Then she continued her work as if she'd seen nothing unusual, her breathing steady, her expression neutral. But something deep in her chest had shifted, the way the ground shifts when an earthquake is still miles away but the earth already knows what's coming. General Webb's eyes were unfocused, the stroke having left its damage in his cognition as well as his motor control. He looked at her face but didn't seem to recognize it. He looked at her name tag. "Ashley," he said, the word coming out slightly slurred. "That's a good name. Had a good soldier once. Saved my life." He paused, as if trying to reach for a memory that was locked behind a door. "Can't quite place where I know that name." Ashley continued documenting his vitals in the chart with careful handwriting. "It's a common name," she said quietly. "You rest. The doctor will be in shortly." She closed the door behind her, and for the first time in 8 years, the compartment where she kept the past threatened to crack open. She walked to the supply closet and stood in the darkness for 43 seconds, her hand pressed against a shelf of gauze, her jaw tight as a knot. Then she stepped back out into the hallway and returned to the work in front of her. Hargrove found out about the general's admission through the hospital grapevine by 3 p.m. The general was stable, the stroke relatively minor, prognosis good for recovery. He would likely be discharged within a week with physical therapy. He would likely not require anything more than standard cardiac monitoring. A routine case. A forgettable case. For anyone else. Hargrove made a phone call at 3:51 p.m. to the hospital's board chairman, a man named Gregory Pierce, who owed him 3 favors from years of consulting on supply contracts. "I need you to know there's a potential issue with one of our nurses," Hargrove said smoothly. "Nothing serious yet. Just something we should monitor." The fluorescent lights cast their relentless glow across the cafeteria at Mercy General, turning everything the color of old bones. Ashley moved through the line with the same efficiency she brought to every task: tray, sandwich, water, apple, each motion economical, purposeful. She'd learned long ago that the smaller you made yourself, the less friction you created. Invisibility was a survival skill. She didn't see Dr. Hargrove until his shoulder caught her lunch tray at precisely the right angle. The tray went airborne. Sandwich tumbled. Apple rolled across the tile floor like a small red accusation. Water splashed in a wide arc, soaking the hem of her scrubs. For a moment, the cafeteria noise dropped to a murmur. 3 other nurses watched from a nearby table. 2 residents turned. The cashier froze mid-transaction. Hargrove stood over the scattered mess, a tall man with the kind of face that had never doubted itself, sharp features, expensive haircut, eyes like a predator assessing prey. He was maybe 38, born into old money and older entitlements. His tie cost more than Ashley's weekly paycheck. "Careful there," he said, his voice carrying across the room like a blade sliding between ribs. "These floors get slippery." He tossed the patient chart down next to her. It landed with a crisp snap against the tile, scattering papers. The movement was deliberate. Theatrical. He wanted witnesses. He had them. "Pick that up, sweetheart." The word dripped with something toxic. "We can't have our new staff creating safety hazards." The room went dead silent. Ashley didn't move immediately. She took one measured breath, the kind she'd learned to take in places where a flinch could get you killed. The kind that meant you were still in control even when someone else thought they held the power. She let her eyes track from the scattered papers to Hargrove's face, and she held that gaze for exactly 3 seconds. Long enough that he felt it. Long enough that everyone watching felt it. One tear escaped her left eye. She wiped it without breaking contact, her movement precise and deliberate. Not a tremor. Not a flinch. Just a woman acknowledging that she'd been seen, and had decided what to say about it. When she spoke, her voice was steady as a surgical laser. "I've cleaned up worse messes than this, Doctor. Some of them even survived." The silence stretched. Hargrove's jaw tightened. He'd expected tears, or defiance, or that particular brand of workplace apology where a woman explains her way into smaller space. He'd expected to break her. What he got instead was someone looking back at him with the kind of calm that suggested she'd already survived things that would have shattered most people into dust. "Get back to work," he said finally, and turned away. But his shoulders had lost that easy confidence. She'd done something worse than cry or protest. She'd suggested, with perfect composure, that his humiliation didn't have the power he thought it did. He spent the next 5 shifts rebuilding that power using methods that didn't require her to be present. By the end of the week, rumors had begun their work. Hargrove moved through the nursing station like a man doing important damage control. He pulled Jennifer Chen aside near the medication cart, Jennifer, who'd been with Mercy General for 9 years and whose opinion carried weight. "I'm not trying to undermine anyone," Hargrove said, lowering his voice with practiced concern, "but we need to talk about the new hire. Her charting is meticulous, sure, but there are some concerns. She flagged 3 billing discrepancies this week alone. 3. It suggests either incompetence or..." He let the implication hang. "A tendency to second-guess established physicians. For a second-week nurse, that's troubling." Jennifer frowned slightly. "That seems like good practice." "In theory, yes. In practice, it creates friction. It makes her look like she doesn't trust the team." He paused. And frankly, her background check was clean but almost suspiciously sparse. Limited work history. References that are harder to reach than they should be. By Monday, he'd called 2 of Ashley's nursing school references, people she'd listed nearly 5 years ago, back when she was still building a paper identity, creating a life that would hold up to casual inspection. Hargrove discovered that one reference had moved 3 times since graduation and couldn't clearly remember working with her. The other was vague about specific accomplishments. He compiled notes, documented concerns, built a file. He sat in the break room on her 10th shift, speaking to Marcus, one of the more insecure residents, who was always eager to align himself with whoever seemed most powerful. Ashley's work is solid though, Marcus offered cautiously. I've seen her catch things in patient charts. Solid isn't excellent, and excellent is what we maintain here at Mercy General. We have a reputation. Hargrove leaned back, the picture of reasonable authority. I'm not saying she's incompetent. I'm saying she needs development. More supervision. Clearer boundaries about what's within her scope of practice. She seems to think she has the right to question everything. The message went out through the unit like water finding cracks. By her 2nd week, no one was making eye contact with Ashley except in the clinical context where they had to. The nurses she'd tried to befriend in the first days suddenly had urgent tasks that pulled them away from conversations. It was a particular kind of isolation, the professional kind, where your competence was questioned not through direct confrontation but through the slow withdrawal of collegial trust. Ashley noticed. Of course she noticed. She'd been trained to read threat assessment, to notice when a perimeter was being tightened, to understand the tactical logic of siege warfare applied to bureaucracy. She also understood that she couldn't fight back. Not yet. Not without revealing things that would trigger worse responses than professional isolation. So she worked her shifts. She charted with precision. She moved through Mercy General like a ghost that had learned to be invisible, doing the job because the work mattered, because there were patients who needed someone who knew how to think under pressure. And then, on a Wednesday night at 2:38 a.m., everything changed. The trauma alert came through the hospital PA system like a shock wave, incoming. Multiple casualties. ETA 6 minutes. Trauma Bay 1 and 2. The ER erupted. Organized chaos became something closer to actual panic when the details came through. A vehicle accident on I-64, but not a simple collision. A military convoy transport had flipped on the elevated section near the downtown interchange. 23 service members en route. Multiple critical injuries. Hargrove appeared in the trauma bay almost immediately, adjusting his trauma gloves with the confidence of someone who'd read about crisis medicine. The attending trauma surgeon, Dr. Patricia Okonkwo, was already setting up the stations, calling for blood bank to mobilize reserves. The ambulances arrived in a cluster, lights strobing, sirens creating a wall of sound that made the ER staff move faster. The first patient came in on a stretcher, a young male with a crushed left side. Tension pneumothorax, the paramedics called it. Lung collapse. Hypertension already setting in. Respiratory distress rapid and deteriorating. 1 minute, maybe 2 before arrest. Hargrove moved to the bedside with his hands extended, and that's when the first error happened. He reached for a chest tube tray. A full open chest tube setup, 14-gauge needle, scalpel, the full surgical procedure. For a tension pneumothorax that needed immediate decompression, it was overkill and timing wasteful. You needed a needle. 14-gauge angiocath, second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. 30 seconds. Not 5 minutes of surgical prep. Second rib, Ashley heard herself say. Her voice came out differently than it had in her first 2 weeks. Lower. Harder. Not a question. A statement. Mid-clavicular. Now. Hargrove's hands paused. Ashley was already moving. There was no conscious decision in it. The calculation happened somewhere beneath language, oxygen saturation dropping, breath sounds absent on left, trachea shifting, ticking clock running at 60 beats per minute. Her hands reached for the needle kit. Muscle memory took over. The kind of memory that came from doing this not once or twice, but in conditions where error meant someone didn't come home. She found the space between his ribs. The needle went in. The hiss of air escaping, that distinctive sound of pressure releasing, of a lung re-expanding, filled the trauma bay. Immediate. Perfect. Get him typed and crossed. He's going to need units, Ashley said, moving back, her voice carrying the weight of someone issuing orders to a team, not requesting permission from a hierarchy. The monitor began its climb. O2 sat at 74. Then 81. Then 88. Sinus rhythm appearing on the screen like a miracle. Hargrove stood frozen. His hands were still extended. His mouth was slightly open. And that's when the real nightmare began. The general's monitor beeped its steady rhythm as Ashley moved through room for 47 at 2:13 a.m., checking fluids and fore placement with the clinical precision that came from years of trauma work. His breathing seemed shallow. She noticed it the way a combat medic notices a soldier moving too slow, not an alarm, just data. Her hand found his wrist. The skin felt cool, slightly clammy. She leaned closer. His breath sounds on the right side came clear and strong, but on the left side, nothing. Silence where there should have been air moving through the lungs. A tension pneumothorax didn't announce itself with fanfare. It killed quietly. The lung collapses. Air fills the space around it. Pressure builds. The heart shifts. Blood flow stops. Minutes become critical. She'd treated 3 during her second tour in Sangin Valley, each one a ticking clock where hesitation meant a body bag. His oxygen saturation was dropping. 88. 86. She watched the monitor climb down like an elevator to nowhere. Trachea shifted. She could see it now, his neck bent slightly as his airway deviated toward the right, pushed by pressure that shouldn't exist. Ashley didn't call for help. She moved instead. Her hands already knew what to do. The crash cart was 3 steps away. The needle drawer was part of muscle memory. 14-gauge angiocath needle. Large bore. Meant for urgent situations exactly like this. She tore open the package. The plastic wrapper fell. Her fingers found the second intercostal space, the anatomical landmark between the second and third ribs, midclavicular line. Same spot she'd marked on training dummies and on actual soldiers bleeding out in desert heat. "General, stay with me." Her voice dropped. Not a request. A command. The kind of command that made people listen even when they didn't understand why. She prepped the skin with iodine in 3 fast circular motions. 84 on the monitor. Falling. The needle went in at a 45-degree angle, penetrating through the chest wall. She felt the resistance of muscle and tissue. Then, the hiss of air escaping. Sudden. Like opening a pressurized container. The sound of a pneumothorax releasing. That was the moment Hargrove burst through the door. "What the hell are you doing?" His voice cut through the room like a blade trying to break glass. "Step away from that patient immediately." Immediately. Ashley didn't remove the needle. Her other hand was already setting up the one-way valve, the flutter valve that would let air escape but not return. O2 sat ticking upward. 75. 80. She worked with the focused calm of someone who'd done this while rounds of small arms fire punched holes in concrete 3 feet away. "You don't have authorization for invasive procedures," Hargrove said, moving toward her. "You're a staff nurse. A second-week staff nurse. This requires physician oversight. This requires..." 86. "Step back, doctor." Ashley's voice didn't rise. It dropped instead, into that register that made combat personnel straighten and pay attention. The register that came from rank. From authority. From someone who'd managed medical emergencies when the alternative was watching people die. 88. The general's oxygen saturation continued climbing. 90. The hiss of the valve released another pocket of trapped air. His breathing deepened. She secured the needle with tape and gauze, her hand steady as a surgical laser. The trembling wasn't fear. It was the precise micro-adjustments of someone who'd held lives together with nothing but proper technique and the absolute refusal to fail. Hargrove stood frozen in the doorway, his face darkening the way it did when his authority was questioned. His mouth opened. Closed. He looked at the monitor. 92. Stable. He looked at the general's chest rising and falling with real breath, not the shallow gasping from moments before. He looked at Ashley's hands, still moving, still working, securing the site with the competence of someone who'd done this 100 times. "I want a full incident report," he said finally, his voice thin. "Everything you did. Every step. I'm documenting this as an authorized intervention." "Already documented," Ashley said without looking at him. She was checking the general's perfusion, his skin color returning from that ashen gray to something approximating normal. Her charting was clinical and complete. Tension pneumothorax suspected based on absent breath sounds left side, tracheal deviation, declining oxygen saturation. Emergency needle decompression performed at 2:13 a.m. using 14-gauge angiocath, second intercostal space, midclavicular line. One-way valve secured. Vital stabilizing. She typed with the precision of someone trained to document emergency medicine in combat conditions where medical records could mean the difference between a soldier getting proper follow-up care or falling through bureaucratic cracks. What she didn't document was the moment Hargrove's expression changed from outrage to something else entirely. Something that looked like calculation. He stood in the doorway, watching her work, and Ashley understood with absolute clarity that he'd just realized two things simultaneously. First, that she was far more than a second-week hospital nurse. Second, that her presence at Mercy General wasn't just a professional problem for him anymore. It was something far more dangerous. A ticking clock had just started counting down. Hargrove left without another word. His footsteps moved down the corridor toward his office, and Ashley knew, the way you know when you've been marked as a target in hostile territory, that he was already making calls. The kind of calls that activated networks. The kind of calls that turned institutional favor into institutional pressure. She finished her assessment of the general. His pupils were reactive. His color improving. His heartbeat steady and strong on the monitor. She was reaching for the blood pressure cuff when the general's hand moved. His fingers closed around her wrist. His eyes were still clouded from the stroke, from the medication, from the general confusion of critical illness. But his grip was strong. Military strong. "You," he whispered. "I know something. I know you." Ashley paused. The unit patch sewn inside her jacket lining, the one from her last deployment, from the operation that had gotten her ordered to disappear, felt suddenly heavy. Like it was burning through the fabric. "Rest now, General," she said quietly. "Just rest." She didn't tell him her name. She couldn't. Not yet. Not while she was supposed to be invisible. Not while his memory was still shattered by the stroke. Not while his own confusion would only compound what the doctors would inevitably tell him, that he was misremembering, combining fragments, experiencing the common disorientation of post-stroke patients trying to assemble meaning from broken neural pathways. She extracted her wrist gently and stepped back to the monitor. The room was quiet except for the steady beeping of his heart. And in that quiet, as Hargrove's phone calls were being made to board members and hospital administrators, as fabricated complaints were being prepared, as an outside investigator was being contacted to review her unauthorized procedures, Ashley stood alone with the knowledge that she had just saved a general's life and in doing so had painted an even larger target on her own back. The general drifted back toward sleep, his grip on consciousness slipping away again. But his hand remained open on the bedsheet, palm up, like a question waiting for an answer that only she could provide. Hargrove's phone calls began at 3:51 a.m. The hospital board chairman answered on the third ring, a man named Bancroft who owed Hargrove favors dating back 7 years, to a time when a certain inappropriate prescription pad had vanished from a certain locked drawer instead of being reported. One sentence was all it took: "We have a dangerous employee." She's practicing medicine without a license. The lie felt clean in Hargrove's mouth, rehearsed from the moment he'd watched Ashley's hands move with the precision of someone who'd done this before, someone who didn't belong in a supply closet pulling for tubing. By 6:13 a.m., Hargrove had contacted the nursing school listed on Ashley's original application. He spoke to someone in admissions who vaguely remembered her file, someone susceptible to the careful suggestion that perhaps certain academic records had been flagged for review years ago, that perhaps there were concerns about how she'd obtained her licensure. He never quite said she'd cheated. He just left space for the implication to settle like sediment. The administrator promised to send a formal inquiry to Mercy General's compliance office. One more tile placed on the board. By 8:22 a.m., Hargrove had retained an outside investigator, a grey man named Pierce who'd built his career on finding problems in employee files that technically existed but had never quite been problems until someone paid him to look hard enough. Pierce specialized in medical credentials. He could request sealed records. He could interview former colleagues. He could build a file thick enough to justify termination for cause, no severance, no negotiation. Hargrove paid him in cash, $3,000, and Pierce didn't ask questions about why a cardiologist cared so much about a second-week floor nurse. The strategy was elegant in its brutality, create so much institutional pressure that Ashley would either crumble under investigation or make a mistake desperate enough to give him ammunition. Either way, the threat disappeared. Hargrove had learned years ago that institutions moved slowly but moved with unstoppable weight once set in motion. And he had weight. He had connections. He had the kind of network that made problems evaporate. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the satisfaction he felt making the calls. The power of it. The way people answered his summons at dawn. The way his voice alone could set machinery in motion. He'd spent the morning feeling like a general moving chess pieces, and by noon he was already thinking about which supply rep to call next, how much he could increase the kickback percentage now that the disruption was being handled. By 2:51 p.m., Hargrove had nearly forgotten about Ashley entirely. She was already disappearing, already becoming a problem that had been solved. Security arrived at 5:38 p.m. Two men in uniforms, professional and impersonal, their badges catching the fluorescent light as they approached Ashley at the medication station. One of them held a written termination notice. His voice was flat, bureaucratic, the kind of tone that made clear this was procedure and not personal. "You need to come with us. Hospital administration has requested your immediate removal from premises." Ashley set down the medication cart. She didn't ask why. She didn't argue. She simply followed them down the corridor, past the nurses' station where conversations died mid-sentence, past the patient rooms where monitors beeped on without her, past the place where she'd been learning to be invisible and had nearly succeeded. The security officers escorted her to her locker without speaking. She removed her badge from around her neck, the badge she'd worn for 14 days, and placed it on the shelf beside her scrubs. Her hands were steady. The trembling was something she did alone, in bathrooms and stairwells, never where it could be weaponized against her. The termination letter cited practicing beyond her scope of licensure. It cited unauthorized medical procedures performed without physician supervision. It cited concerns raised by previous educational institutions and a pattern of deception in her employment file. None of it was true, but all of it was procedural. All of it was legal. All of it came from Hargrove's careful architecture of lies, each one reinforcing the others until they became indistinguishable from fact. She was being erased not because she'd done anything wrong, but because she'd noticed something Hargrove needed hidden, and he'd decided that eliminating her was simpler than changing his behavior. The evening rain fell in sheets as she left Mercy General for the last time. 3 weeks of careful placement, of learning rhythms and faces, and where the supply closet held bandages for the patients nobody was watching, and it evaporated in an afternoon. She sat in her car in the parking garage on the 3rd level, rain drumming on the roof like communication from a world she no longer inhabited. Her clearance to exist had been revoked by someone who didn't even know her real name. 3 days later, she sat in the VA hospital waiting room in Hampton at 9:06 a.m. The chair was plastic and cold. The intake forms in her lap required information she couldn't honestly provide. Social Security number, hers had been buried with her identity in 2019. Employment history, nothing she could write down without surfacing classified operations and names that belonged in redacted files. Previous medical providers, the field hospitals in Sangin that technically never existed, staffed by people who'd never been deployed. The waiting room was full of men and women in various states of damage, all of them veterans, all of them real in ways the civilian world didn't understand. Some of them had probably fought in the same war she'd bled in. None of them would recognize her. She was just another patient now, someone waiting to be called back to an examination room where a doctor would ask where the scars came from and she would have to choose between truth and survival. The rain outside the waiting room windows was relentless. It fell with the weight of judgment, of consequence, of every choice that had led from Sangin Valley to a plastic chair in a waiting room where the television played news programs about wars that official records said she'd never fought in. She pulled her jacket tighter, the jacket with the unit patch sewn into the lining, still there, still hidden, the only proof that the woman she'd been had actually existed. She almost took it out. Almost held it in her hands and asked the waiting room if anyone recognized the insignia, if anyone remembered the operations it represented. Almost threw it away completely and became what the paperwork suggested, no one. Nothing. A ghost applying for veterans' benefits as a ghost, a name that didn't officially exist trying to access services for a person who'd been officially erased. But then something changed. A sound cut through the rain and the television and the fluorescent hum of the waiting room, a distant percussion, rhythmic and precise. A helicopter, far away still, maybe 15 miles out, maybe crossing the water from Naval Station Norfolk. The sound was familiar in a way that reached into her chest and found the part of her that couldn't be erased no matter what Hargrove's paperwork had tried to suggest. That sound meant movement. It meant purpose. It meant someone had finally asked the right question about why a decorated senior chief petty officer had simply vanished from a cardiac ward. The waiting room nurses continued with their afternoon charts. The rain continued to fall. And somewhere in the distance, the rotor blades kept their steady conversation with the wind, getting closer, getting louder, turning from a whisper into a promise. The rotor blades cut the afternoon air like a surgeon's hands parting flesh. 2 Black Hawks dropped toward the lawn at Mercy General, their downdraft scattering trash and turning every head in the lobby toward the windows. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The landing gear kissed asphalt at 3:13 p.m. on a Tuesday, and a SEAL team leader in full combat gear strode through the automatic doors with the kind of presence that made institutional hierarchy feel suddenly very fragile. His boots echoed on tile, 1, 2, 3, 4, each step a percussion statement. Behind him came 2 more operators, then a Navy commander in dress white so crisp they could cut skin. The lobby froze. Doctors mid-conversation stopped talking. Nurses gripped clipboards like anchors. The SEAL team leader moved to the information desk with the terrifying fluid precision of someone who'd spent 15 years making decisions that killed or saved people. His eyes were the color of a stormy Atlantic after a hurricane. "We need Senior Chief Ashley Cooper. Now." Not a request. It was a command. His voice carried the weight of 4,847 combat hours. The desk nurse's hands trembled as she reached for the phone. Security didn't move to stop him. Nobody in a hospital challenges a combat uniform that carries itself like that. They found Ashley in room 447, checking the general's post-procedure vitals. His oxygen saturation was 98% now. His blood pressure stable. The stroke had left him with short-term memory loss, but something in his eyes had begun to recognize the nurse who'd been sitting with him for the past 72 hours. When the SEAL team leader appeared in the doorway, Ashley didn't flinch. She finished recording the numbers on his chart. Then she turned. "I've been fired. I'm not supposed to be here." Her voice came out steady as a combat medic's hands. The team leader's jaw tightened. That is about to change. The general's daughter, Commander Sarah Cooper, no relation, though the name would haunt Hargrove later when investigators traced the pattern, stepped forward with a file folder worn soft at the edges from being handled thousands of times. Behind her came hospital staff who'd been summoned by security, doctors, and nurses who'd worked alongside Ashley for 2 weeks without knowing who she actually was. The room was a library of silence. The daughter opened the file. Senior Chief Petty Officer, she read, a voice carrying the weight of inherited command. A nurse beside her began to tremble. One of the residents whispered something to a colleague who grabbed the door frame. 3 bronze stars. Another layer. Another silence. The attending physician's face went pale. 2 of them with valor. The folder kept opening. The facts kept accumulating like ordnance. Ashley stood without moving. 1 breath. That was all. Not tears. Not trembling. Just a woman watching her invisible life become suddenly, irrevocably visible. Navy Cross. The daughter's voice cracked. For the Sangin operation. 3 survivors extracted under fire. 37 minutes. 3 miles. The general's eyes widened. His damaged memory couldn't place the details, but something primordial in his neurology responded to the name, to the woman standing 4 feet from his hospital bed. His fingers began to move toward her. Ashley took 1 step closer without looking at anyone else in the room. Just him. Just the man whose blood she'd wiped from her uniform in 2019. 2 purple hearts. The commander continued. Presidential Unit Citation. The file closed. The silence lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then Hargrove burst through the crowd, his face the color of raw meat, his voice a weapon fired without ammunition. This is a personnel matter. Hospital policy requires, an FBI agent stepped forward. His badge caught the fluorescent light. His partner appeared from behind the door with handcuffs clicking open like a metronome counting down. Dr. Marcus Hargrove. The agent's voice was a punch delivered without raising his hand. You're under arrest for wire fraud, identity theft, and attempting to forge federal military records. We've been monitoring your supplier kickback scheme for 18 months. 40% inflation on invoice billings. $273,000 across 3 years. Hargrove's skin went the color of old paper. His mouth opened. Nothing came out. But here's what sealed it, the agent continued, stepping closer until Hargrove had nowhere to move except backward. You accessed classified databases. You attempted to fabricate disciplinary records against Chief Cooper using forged federal documents. You tried to bury evidence of a Navy Cross recipient because she threatened your financial arrangement. That gave us federal jurisdiction. That made this FBI. The handcuffs went on at 3:26 p.m. The ratcheting sound they made was the sound of 31 years of unchecked institutional power finally meeting resistance it couldn't manipulate or buy or call in favors to escape. Hargrove's breathing came in rapid, shallow gasps. His eyes darted around the room looking for an ally, a way out, a hierarchy that still protected him. There wasn't one. The officers turned him toward the corridor. They walked him past the cafeteria where he'd knocked her lunch tray to the floor 2 weeks prior. Every nurse on shift stopped working and watched. Not one of them looked away. The silence followed him like a wake. By the time they reached the lobby, he was trembling. By the time they crossed the threshold toward the waiting unmarked car, he'd started to sob. 2 years passed. Mercy General added a veteran services wing funded by donations that appeared mysteriously in the hospital foundation's accounts, donations that matched exactly the amount Hargrove had stolen. Dr. Pierce, the new chief of cardiology, instituted blind billing audits that caught 2 more providers with similar arrangements. The hospital newsletter ran an article about the Sangin Guardian, though Ashley's name was never in it. She didn't want recognition. Recognition was a luxury for people who got to stay. Except the general's memory came back. Not all at once. Fragments at first, the sound of helicopters, the weight of her hands, the way she'd sung to keep him conscious through 3 miles of gunfire and blood loss that should have killed him 17 times before the extraction point. When the neural pathways finally reconnected, he was sitting in his daughter's living room watching a news segment about healthcare corruption, and he started to cry. his daughter found him with the old uniform photograph from 2019 in his lap, 3 of them in desert camouflage, weapon slung, the one on the left labeled Senior Chief A. Cooper, Sangin Guardian Angel in handwriting that matched the tattoo on his forearm. He found her through Pentagon channels, through Navy personnel records, through people who owed him favors from 40 years of command. It took 3 weeks. It took pulling in every marker from every subordinate who'd ever served under him. And on a Friday morning at 8:06 a.m., Ashley was preparing the supply cart on the 3rd floor when she heard the distinctive sound of a dress-white uniform being pressed, that specific hiss of a steam iron meeting fabric that carries authority. She turned. He was standing there in uniform, commander still, though the medals on his chest told the story of what he'd lived through since Sangin. Behind him stood his daughter in navy dress blues. Behind them both stood the SEAL team leader. The general's hands were shaking. Actual, visible trembling, not from fear but from recognition finally complete. From memory fully restored. From standing in front of the woman who'd saved his life and realizing he'd spent 2 weeks in a hospital bed with her and forgotten every moment. Senior Chief Petty Officer Ashley Cooper, he said, his voice thick with something that wasn't tears but something heavier. I was ordered to forget you. My memory took that seriously. He smiled, a real one, the kind that shows you what someone looked like before war. I'm done forgetting. She received her promotion in a ceremony nobody filmed and nobody posted online. In a quiet hospital conference room at 2:22 p.m. on a Thursday, the general's hands moved to her collar, and he pinned the Master Chief insignia into place with the kind of deliberation that suggested he was pinning significance back into the world. His daughter read the citation, 18 lines of classified operations declassified just for this moment. 47 saves. 3 extractions under fire. 1 Navy Cross. 1 woman who'd never told anyone who she actually was because the Pentagon had ordered her to disappear and she'd obeyed because that's what warriors do. Afterward, they walked past the cafeteria together. A resident was standing there. He looked up from his coffee and went pale. Then he looked at Ashley, really looked at her, and something shifted behind his eyes. Recognition maybe. Understanding certainly. That trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. The kind of control that comes from someone who knows exactly what her hands are capable of and chooses every day to use them to help instead. Ashley went back into the scrubs the next morning. Not in a management position. Not in an office. On the floor, in room for 47, where an elderly 4-star general was being discharged with restored memory and a tattoo on his forearm that finally made sense again. She was pushing the discharge cart when he reached out and grabbed her wrist, not from confusion this time, but from gratitude. From the knowledge that she'd saved him in 2019 and she'd done it again in 2024 without anyone asking her to. Without anyone knowing to ask. Why, he said. Why not take the directorship they offered? Why stay as a bedside nurse? Ashley checked his discharge papers. She made sure his medications were correct. She adjusted his for-pole though it didn't need adjusting. My fight is here now, sir. The battles that matter don't always happen in conference rooms. She looked at him directly, and in that moment, for the first time, the full weight of who she was became visible in her eyes. Not a uniform. Not medals. Just a woman whose capacity for saving lives hadn't diminished when the Pentagon tried to erase her. And I need to be where people still bleed. Where hands still matter more than rank. The general's daughter was waiting in the lobby with a photograph, the one from 2019. All 3 of them. It went into a frame. Ashley's copy went into her locker at Mercy General. Her copy was placed on the general's office wall at the Pentagon. And Hargrove? Witnesses reported seeing him 6 months later at a strip mall in Tucson working weekend shifts at an insurance kiosk. His name tag read, Steve. When customers recognized him, which they sometimes did, he flinched. He didn't correct them. He just took their payment and processed their paperwork with the grim efficiency of someone who'd learned that institutional power was temporary, that secrets had expiration dates, and that the quiet person in the room was sometimes the most dangerous because she had nothing left to lose. the law found him again 6 months after that on a wire fraud charge related to the insurance policies. He pled guilty. Nobody was surprised. Scars tell stories. Some are visible. Some are tattooed on the forearm of a 4-star general. Some are invisible, carried by women in scrubs who nobody recognized until the moment the truth couldn't stay buried anymore. You don't need a badge or a gun to be a warrior. Did you know that veterans are routinely placed in positions where their qualifications are hidden? That hospitals frequently employ talented professionals without knowing their backgrounds. Tell us in the comments, would you have recognized Ashley Cooper, or would she have remained invisible to you? Subscribe for more stories about the heroes working among us, the ones we pass every day in hallways, not knowing what they've survived to get there.